Welcome back to My Bake Escape. Recently, I was asked what my favorite thing to bake is, and I had to think about it for a minute, and then I realized that my favorite thing to bake is cookies, specifically chocolate chip cookies. And the reason for it is because you can make a batch of chocolate chip cookies from start to finish in less than 30 minutes. You can pack them up, you can share them, they are always delicious. And so I have a chocolate chip cookie recipe for you today. What I made is a salted caramel chocolate chip cookie, and these turned out delicious. For the full recipe, visit mybakeescape.com. Be sure to follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and Pinterest at mybakeescape. So for this recipe, you will need all-purpose flour, brown sugar, granulated sugar, butter, semi-sweet chocolate chips, vanilla extract, salt, baking soda, 2 eggs, and these delicious caramel sea salt baking chips from Trader Joe's. I actually followed the recipe on the back of this bag. I did a few modifications. I added the semi-sweet chocolate chips and less salt than what was called because these chips are actually pretty salty. They're delicious, but I went ahead and only added 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt. If you're not able to get your hands on a bag of these specific salted caramel chips, you can substitute butterscotch chips for this recipe. The first step is to combine the dry ingredients. So to the flour, I add the baking soda followed by the salt. Mix that together. Then I set that aside and begin on the wet ingredients, starting with the sugars. To the sugars, I add the room temperature butter. Now you could use brown butter, but it's really not necessary for this recipe. I went ahead and took my butter out an hour before wanting to use it, and this is what the room temperature consistency looks like. It's soft enough that it'll make a dent in the butter, but it won't totally mush or melt. You can do this in a stand mixer. I'm using a hand mixer today. So what you want to do is combine the sugars and butter until they are light and fluffy. And it took about 2 minutes of mixing to get to this consistency. So the sugars are completely absorbed, the butter's lightly whipped, everything is all mixed together. The next step is to incorporate the eggs one at a time. So I add one of the eggs, mix it until it is well incorporated into the butter and sugar mixture. You want to mix it until you no longer see the yellow of the egg. And then add the next egg and repeat. Once the vanilla is mixed in, it's time to add the flour mixture. I like to do this in 2 batches, adding half of it, mixing it in, and then adding the rest and mixing just until the flour is absorbed into the wet ingredients. Another reason why I love cookies is because you can make the dough in advance. The cookie dough will last in your refrigerator up to 5 days. So I know around the holidays we tend to do a lot, and if you wanted to get a head start on your baking, you can definitely do that with cookies. So you can make this dough and store it in your refrigerator up to 5 days. You can also make it one day and then just bake off a few cookies every day to have those fresh, warm, delicious cookies from the oven whenever you want. You can also freeze cookie dough, and towards the end of this video, I'm going to show you how I freeze my cookie dough and then how I bake them from the freezer as well. So as you can see, the flour is pretty much absorbed into the wet ingredients. I'm just kind of making sure that all of the flour at the bottom is well incorporated into the wet ingredients. Once it reaches this stage, you can go ahead and stop mixing and then fold in the chocolate chips and the caramel chips. I really take my time to mix all of the chips in. I want to make sure that they are evenly distributed throughout the dough, and the texture of the cookies is not too stiff. I'm able to mix by hand pretty easily. Now, if you did use a browned butter, the dough would be a little bit softer, but since I used room temperature butter, this is the consistency of the dough. The next step is to scoop the rounds of dough onto a parchment lined cookie sheet. I like to use a ice cream scoop for this. It just makes it easy to have similar size cookies. And before these go in the oven, I like to press each cookie down slightly. I wet my hands just a little bit. Using the palm of my hands, I press down slightly on top of each cookie. This will just help them bake a little more evenly. I also like to add a few chocolate chips on the tops. That way you can tell what is in the cookie. Unfortunately, I forgot to set aside some of those caramel sea salt baking chips, but I did have extra semi-sweet chocolate ones, so I went ahead and added those on top, and that's what they look like before going into the oven. They have baked for about 6 minutes in a 375-degree oven, so I like to rotate the pan midway through. This is what they look like at 6 minutes, and they baked for another 5 minutes, and then I took them out. You do not want to keep them in the oven past this point because they will continue to cook on the baking sheet. So I went ahead and placed the baking sheet on a cooling rack, and you can see I'm using a spatula to kind of separate the cookies where they touched slightly. And as they cool, they will flatten out a little bit and really turn into the crispy on the edges and soft and gooey in the middle cookie. This was just 2 minutes out of the oven. I tried to pick one up, but it was still really soft and almost fell apart. So I went ahead and let them continue to cool on the cookie sheet for another 5 minutes. And after 5 minutes, I'm able to handle the cookie. You can hear that it's crispy on the edges. I love a cookie that has crispy, buttery edges, but is soft and gooey in the middle, and these are delicious. They turned out just that way. So to allow them to cool completely, I transferred the cookies onto a cooling rack and let them cool for another 5 to 7 minutes before packing these up. As I mentioned earlier, you can store this cookie dough in the refrigerator for up to 5 days. So I place it in an airtight container and keep it in my refrigerator and scoop out portions as I need them throughout the week. You can also freeze cookie dough, and the way that I freeze my cookie dough is by using plastic wrap. So I have a piece of plastic wrap here on my work surface. I scoop out the portion of dough that I want to freeze, and I carefully shape this into a log. I try to make the log as even as possible throughout from end to end, so the same type of thickness throughout. This will help me later when I want to cut these and portion them out when it's a frozen log, and it will help to ensure that the cookies are even as they bake from frozen. Once the cookie dough is shaped into a log, I seal off the edges and place in a freezer safe bag because I don't want this to get frostbite. I usually store this for up to a month in my freezer and try to freeze it on a flat surface so that your log maintains that shape and it's easy to portion out later on. So I had this in my freezer for a couple of weeks and waited for a cold and rainy day when I felt like having some freshly baked cookies. So this was the perfect day for that. I pulled my log out of the freezer, and as you can see, I didn't lay it flat, and so it has a weird little shape, but that's okay. I made it work. My suggestion is to let the log sit on the counter for about 10 minutes before you try to cut it. I was impatient this day and went ahead and started cutting from frozen, and I struggled a little bit, but I used a serrated knife and carefully cut out cookie portions from the log. Once I cut the portions that I wanted, I went ahead and wrapped the log up again, placed it in that plastic bag, and back in the freezer for another rainy day. Placed the frozen cookie pucks, let's call them pucks because that's what they look like at this point, on a parchment lined baking sheet and baked as I normally would at 375-degree Fahrenheit oven for about 10 to 12 minutes, and this is what they look like, straight from the freezer into the oven and freshly out of the oven. They turned out really delicious, golden brown buttery edges and a gooey chocolatey center, just how I like them. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have questions about this process, feel free to leave those in the comment section. I wish everybody a happy holiday season. Thank you for watching and have a sweet day.